You learn this lesson quietly, usually after you've already paid for it. Not with money, but with energy, time, and a certain dulling of the mind. You notice it when your days feel heavier than they should, when your inner silence is interrupted by problems that were never yours, when your discipline begins to erode for reasons you can't fully explain. At first, you assume this is just life, responsibility, compassion, strength. You tell yourself that strong people carry weight, that disciplined people endure. But there is a difference between carrying your own weight and being crushed by someone else's refusal to carry theirs. There are people who do not want to be saved. This is not a moral judgment. It is an observation. They move through life, leaving unfinished work behind them, broken structures, unresolved habits, and they wait consciously or not for someone else to stabilize what they refuse to face. When you enter their orbit, they feel relief. When you offer help, they feel justified. And when you stay, they learn something dangerous, that they can remain exactly as they are because you will absorb the cost. At first, you feel useful, needed. There is a quiet pride in being the one who shows up when others retreat. You tell yourself this is strength of character, stoic endurance, emotional control. But this pride is subtle, and that is why it is dangerous. It disguises itself as virtue while slowly training you to ignore a simple truth. No amount of discipline can substitute for another person's responsibility. And when you try, you do not elevate them. You lower yourself. You begin to notice the imbalance not in dramatic moments, but in small internal shifts. You postpone your own work because there is always a crisis. You soften your boundaries because their emotions feel fragile. You speak less honestly because truth would disrupt the fragile equilibrium you've built around them. Slowly, your self-control is no longer directed inward, where it belongs, but outward, where it is wasted. You are not mastering yourself anymore. You are managing someone else's chaos. This is where destruction begins, not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly. Discipline erodes first. You wake earlier, but accomplish less. You think more, but act less. Your mind is busy, but not clear. Stoicism teaches restraint, but restraint is not the same as self-erasure. Emotional control is not emotional suppression in service of someone else's dysfunction. When you save the wrong people, you are not practicing virtue. You are practicing avoidance, avoiding the discomfort of letting them face consequences, and avoiding the deeper discomfort of asking why you feel responsible for them in the first place. The people you should never save are often drawn to your calm. They sense your stability the way a storm senses open land. Your silence feels like safety to them. Your consistency feels like shelter. But shelter becomes dependency when there is no intention to ever leave it. And dependency has a cost. It teaches them helplessness and teaches you resentment. You may deny that resentment at first. You tell yourself you are above it. But it shows up anyway, in impatience, in fatigue, in a quiet hardening of the heart. A disciplined mind notices patterns without rushing to justify them. Look carefully. The people who destroy you do not usually do it through malice. They do it through repetition. The same promises, the same apologies, the same crisis slightly rearranged, and each time you respond with the same sacrifice. Over time, this trains your nervous system to live in constant readiness, always bracing for someone else's instability. Inner silence disappears. Reflection becomes shallow. You are always reacting. Stoicism does not ask you to be cruel. It asks you to be honest. Honest about what you can control and what you cannot. Honest about where responsibility ends. Honest about the difference between helping and enabling. When you save someone from the consequences of their own choices, you are not acting with wisdom. You are interfering with the only teacher they might listen to, reality. And reality is patient. It will wait until you are exhausted, until your boundaries are thin, until your identity becomes tangled with their survival. This is why the cost is so high. You do not just lose time or peace, you lose clarity. You forget who you are when you are not rescuing. You measure your worth by how much you can endure, not by how well you live. Self-mastery becomes self-neglect, and the irony is sharp. In trying to be strong for someone else, you slowly become weaker for yourself. A Stoic life is built on alignment between thought and action, value and behavior. Saving those who refuse to save themselves breaks that alignment. It asks you to live in contradiction, to preach responsibility while practicing rescue, to value discipline while rewarding disorder. Your mind feels the tension, even if you don't name it. That tension is the beginning of destruction, not because you cared, but because you cared without limits, without judgment, without restraint. Restraint is not coldness, it is precision. It is knowing where your effort produces growth and where it produces decay. There are people whose struggles sharpen you, and there are people whose struggles consume you. Wisdom is telling the difference before your identity is eroded by good intentions. This is not a call to abandon everyone. It is a call to abandon illusions, especially the illusion that your strength exists to compensate for someone else's refusal to grow. Your strength exists to shape your character, your actions, your inner world. When it is diverted endlessly outward, it no longer serves its purpose. If you feel tired in a way rest does not fix, if your discipline feels strained rather than steady, if your silence is filled with someone else's noise, pause. Observe. Do not explain it away. The Stoic path begins with clear seeing, and clear seeing often reveals a hard truth. Some people are not drowning. They are simply unwilling to swim. And if you stay in the water with them long enough, they will not learn to float. You will forget how. You do not notice the shift when it happens. That is the most dangerous part. There is no single moment where you say, "Now I am being drained." Instead, it reveals itself through small compromises you barely register. You answer messages you meant to ignore. You delay your own work because someone else is unraveling again. You tell yourself you will return to your discipline tomorrow once things calm down. Tomorrow becomes a habit. Calm never arrives. The people who destroy you rarely ask for everything at once. They take pieces, a little attention here, a little patience there, a little forgiveness, repeated too often. Each request feels reasonable on its own. Taken together, they form a quiet occupation of your inner life. You begin to live in response mode, always alert, always adjusting. This constant readiness feels like responsibility, but it is closer to surrender. You start editing yourself, not dramatically, subtly. You withhold honest thoughts because they might destabilize the person you're supporting. You soften truths because you don't want to deal with the fallout. You tell yourself timing matters, that now is not the moment. Over time, you forget what it feels like to speak without calculation. Inner silence is replaced by monitoring. You are no longer present, you are managing. This is where self-control becomes distorted. Stoicism values restraint, but restraint is inward-facing. It is about governing impulse, not suppressing truth to keep others comfortable. When your restraint exists primarily to protect someone else from discomfort, it is no longer discipline. It is fear dressed as virtue. Fear of conflict, fear of abandonment, fear of being seen as cold when you are simply being clear. The Stoics warned against misplaced attachment, not because attachment is evil, but because it clouds judgment. When your identity becomes tied to being needed, your clarity suffers. You begin to confuse usefulness with worth. You endure more than you should, not because it is right, but because it confirms a story you've told yourself, that your value lies in carrying what others drop. Notice how this affects your sense of self. Your routines weaken. The practices that once grounded you, reflection, solitude, deliberate effort, feel optional now. There is always something more urgent, someone more fragile, a situation that can't wait. But urgency is often a performance, and fragility, when constantly accommodated, becomes permanent. You may tell yourself that walking away would be selfish, that endurance is proof of character, but endurance without direction is not strength, it is inertia. Stoic endurance is chosen, not imposed by someone else's refusal to change. It is rooted in principle, not guilt. If your persistence leaves you depleted, resentful, and internally scattered, it is not virtuous, it is misdirected. Pay attention to the emotional tone of your days. Are you calm or merely quiet? There is a difference. Calm comes from alignment. Quiet can come from suppression. When you are suppressing yourself for the sake of someone else's stability, your emotions do not disappear. They accumulate, they harden. They show up later as irritation, cynicism, or a dull sense of emptiness you can't explain. This is how destruction progresses, not as chaos, but as erosion. You are still functioning, still helping, still admired for your patience. But inside, your standards are slipping. You tolerate behavior you would never accept for yourself. You excuse patterns you would advise anyone else to confront. You are no longer living by your values. You are negotiating with them. Stoicism does not teach endless tolerance. It teaches discernment, the ability to see what is within your control and what is not, and to act accordingly. You cannot control whether someone chooses responsibility. You cannot control whether they learn from consequences, but you can control whether you place yourself between them and reality. And every time you do, you teach them the wrong lesson and teach yourself the wrong role. There is a subtle arrogance in saving people who refuse to change. It hides beneath compassion, but it is there. It assumes you know better than reality itself, that your presence can succeed where consequences have failed, that your patience can do what their own discomfort could not. This belief flatters the ego even as it empties the spirit. Ask yourself honestly, if this person were not in crisis, would they still seek your presence? Or is your role contingent on their instability? If your value disappears when things are calm, that is not connection, that is dependency. And dependency always demands payment. As this continues, your inner world grows crowded. Your thoughts are no longer your own. They orbit someone else's problems. Even in solitude, you are rehearsing conversations, anticipating breakdowns, preparing solutions no one asked you to solve. The mind never rests when it has assumed responsibility it was never meant to carry. Self-mastery requires space, silence, a degree of detachment, not coldness but clarity. You cannot cultivate this while constantly absorbing the emotional spillover of someone who refuses to contain themselves. Their disorder becomes your environment, and environments shape behavior. Eventually, something in you resists. You feel it as fatigue or frustration or a sudden urge to withdraw. Do not dismiss this as weakness. It is information. The body often recognizes misalignment before the mind admits it. The Stoics listened to these signals not to indulge them, but to understand what had gone wrong. What has gone wrong is not that you cared. Caring is not the mistake. The mistake is confusing care with obligation and obligation with identity. You are not here to be consumed by other people's unfinished lives. You are here to build your own deliberately, responsibly, with restraint. The people you should never save do not collapse without you. They adapt. They find someone else, or they finally confront themselves. Either way, the world continues. The only question is whether you emerge intact or diminished by years spent trying to be a substitute for someone else's will. This is not abandonment, it is correction, a return to proper order, responsibility back where it belongs, attention returned to its rightful owner. And the first step is seeing clearly how quietly you have been giving yourself away. Once you begin to see it, you cannot unsee it. The pattern sharpens. You notice how often your presence is used as a buffer between someone and the consequences they avoid. You see how quickly their urgency becomes your interruption, how their instability dictates the rhythm of your days. And with this clarity comes discomfort, not because you are cruel, but because you are no longer deceived. There is a moment, often brief, where you consider pulling back, not dramatically, just enough to breathe. And almost immediately, resistance appears. They become anxious, or offended, or suddenly helpless. This reaction is revealing. It shows you that what they valued was not you as a person, but you as a function, a stabilizer, a shock absorber, a place where their excess could be deposited without cost. This is where self-awareness deepens. You begin to ask questions you once avoided. Why does their distress override your discipline? Why does your routine bend so easily around their disorder? Why do you feel responsible for outcomes that depend entirely on choices you do not make? These questions are uncomfortable because they threaten an identity you may have built quietly over time. The identity of the reliable one, the strong one, the one who never leaves. But identity built on endurance alone is fragile. It requires constant strain to maintain. Stoicism teaches that a stable identity is grounded in principle, not reaction. If your sense of self depends on being needed, you will unconsciously seek out neediness or tolerate it far longer than wisdom allows. Notice how often your internal dialogue centers on justification. You explain their behavior, you contextualize their failures, you remind yourself of their past, their pain, their circumstances. Compassion becomes a lens through which you blur reality. Understanding turns into excuse-making. And slowly the line between empathy and self-betrayal disappears. The Stoics were not indifferent to suffering, but they were disciplined in how they responded to it. They understood that pity can be as distorting as anger. Both pull you out of alignment. Both tempt you to act from impulse rather than judgment. When you rush to save, you are often acting to relieve your own discomfort with watching someone struggle, not to actually help them grow. Growth requires friction. Responsibility requires pressure. When you remove these in the name of kindness, you delay development. And when you do this repeatedly, you become an obstacle rather than an ally. This is a difficult truth to accept, especially if you pride yourself on being supportive. But support that prevents accountability is not support. It is interference. Look closely at how your boundaries have shifted. Once you chose when to give. Now you respond automatically. Once you decided how much to offer. Now, the amount is dictated by someone else's needs, which are never stable. This is not generosity. It is loss of authorship over your own energy. Self-control is not only about resisting harmful impulses. It is also about resisting harmful roles. The role of savior is one of the most seductive because it feels meaningful. It offers purpose without requiring introspection. As long as you are focused on fixing someone else, you do not have to confront the parts of yourself that remain unfinished. Ask yourself what you avoid by staying entangled. Is it loneliness? Is it the fear of seeming irrelevant? Is it the quiet work of facing your own limits? Sometimes we save others because it gives structure to our lives, even if that structure is draining. Chaos, at least, is familiar. But discipline demands something else. It demands that you choose the harder path of restraint, that you tolerate the discomfort of not intervening, that you allow others to feel the weight of their choices, even when it makes you uneasy. This is not indifference. It is respect for their capacity to grow and for your own need to remain whole. You may notice guilt rising when you consider stepping back. Guilt is a powerful tool, often weaponized by those who benefit from your overextension. But guilt is not a moral compass. It is an emotional response, often shaped by conditioning rather than truth. Stoicism teaches you to examine emotions, not obey them blindly. Observe how quickly guilt fades when you are aligned with principle. When your actions are consistent with reason, the noise quiets. There may still be sadness, but it is clean. It does not corrode. Resentment, on the other hand, is a sign that you have violated your own standards too many times. There is also fear, the fear that if you stop saving, you will be seen as heartless, but reputation is external. It is not yours to control. The Stoic concern is character, not applause. You do not owe the world an image of endless availability. You owe yourself integrity. As you pull back, even slightly, you reclaim fragments of yourself. Time opens. Mental space returns. You begin to hear your own thoughts again, not just echoes of someone else's urgency. This is not abandonment. It is recalibration, a return to proportion. Not everyone will accept this change. Some will accuse you of changing. They are correct. You are changing from someone who absorbs disorder to someone who maintains order. From someone who confuses sacrifice with virtue to someone who understands limits. The people you should never say often respond to boundaries with escalation. Their crisis intensifies, their language sharpens. This is not evidence that you are wrong, it is evidence that the old arrangement no longer serves them, and that is precisely the point. A disciplined life cannot be built on constant rescue. It requires continuity, ritual, self-trust. When your energy is fragmented, your growth stalls. You may appear strong to others, but internally you are stagnant. Stoicism is not about appearing strong, it is about becoming steady. Steadiness comes from choosing where your effort belongs, from recognizing that not every struggle is yours to enter, from understanding that the most compassionate act is sometimes restraint, not because you do not care, but because you care enough to let reality do its work. This is the quiet turning point, the moment you stop measuring your worth by how much you can endure for others and begin measuring it by how well you govern yourself. Nothing dramatic happens, no applause, just a subtle return of balance. And that is how real change begins. When you stop intervening, even slightly, the silence can feel unfamiliar, not peaceful at first exposed. You are no longer filling the space with solutions, reassurance, or emotional labor. You are present with yourself again, and that presence demands honesty. Without the distraction of someone else's turmoil, you become aware of the ways you have been living reactively. This awareness can feel unsettling, but it is necessary. In this quiet, you begin to see how often your actions were driven by urgency rather than intention. Urgency bypasses judgment. It convinces you that everything must be addressed now, that delay is cruelty, that restraint is neglect. But urgency is rarely a signal of truth. More often it is a strategy, sometimes unconscious, used by those who cannot tolerate the slow work of responsibility. The Stoics valued measured response. They understood that a calm mind acts with precision, not haste. When you were constantly saving, your responses were fast, but not thoughtful. You moved to relieve tension, not to cultivate strength. In doing so, you trained yourself to equate speed with care and reaction with virtue. Now, as you pause, guilt may surface again. It arrives quietly, suggesting you are abandoning your principles. But look closely. Are your principles actually being tested, or is a habit being interrupted? There is a difference. Principles endure scrutiny. Habits resist change. What you feel may not be moral conflict at all. It may simply be withdrawal from a role that once defined you. In this space, you confront another truth. Not everyone respects boundaries, but everyone benefits from them. Boundaries clarify roles. They reveal who is willing to meet you as an equal and who only values access. When you limit your availability, some relationships stabilize, others fracture. This information is not a loss. It is a refinement. You may notice how your body responds. Tension begins to release. Sleep improves. Your thoughts slow. This is not because problems have vanished, but because your nervous system is no longer bracing for someone else's instability. Calm returns not as an emotional high, but as a baseline. This is the calm Stoicism speaks of, not excitement, but steadiness. With steadiness comes discernment. You begin to differentiate between those who are struggling and those who are avoiding. Struggle has direction, even when it is messy. Avoidance repeats itself without progress. When you saved indiscriminately, you treated both the same. Now, you see the cost of that error. Discipline, at its core, is about choice, not the grand, visible choices, but the quiet ones made daily. Choosing when to engage, choosing when to withdraw, choosing not to explain yourself excessively. Each choice reinforces your identity as someone who acts from reason rather than impulse. You may feel the urge to justify your change, to explain your limits, to soften them so they are more palatable. Notice this urge. It is another attempt to manage others' reactions. You do not need permission to govern your own life. Clarity does not require consensus. Stoicism does not promise comfort. It promises coherence. When your actions align with your values, discomfort becomes tolerable because it has meaning. When you lived in constant rescue, discomfort was endless and corrosive because it had no direction. Now, discomfort, when it appears, is temporary. It signals growth. As you reclaim your time, you may rediscover neglected parts of yourself, practices you abandoned, thoughts you postponed, ambitions you quietly shelved. This is not selfishness. It is restoration. You cannot cultivate excellence while perpetually stabilizing dysfunction. The people you should never save may accuse you of being different. They may say you have become distant, cold, or changed. In a sense, they are right. You are no longer accessible in the way you once were. But accessibility is not a measure of virtue. Integrity is. Observe how your inner dialogue shifts. You are less reactive, more deliberate. You no longer rush to fill silence with reassurance. You allow discomfort to exist without immediately neutralizing it. This restraint strengthens you. It also teaches others something essential, that they are capable of bearing their own weight. There is a quiet respect in this stance, not the kind that seeks recognition, but the kind that arises from consistency. Over time, those who are willing to grow adjust to your boundaries. They step forward. They take responsibility. Those who are not drift away or escalate. Both outcomes are instructive. This phase requires patience. Old patterns do not dissolve instantly. You may be tempted to step back into rescue when things become tense. This is where discipline matters most, not as rigidity, but as commitment to long-term clarity over short-term relief. You are not responsible for the emotions others feel when you stop carrying what was never yours. Emotions are responses, not verdicts. Let them pass. Remain steady. The Stoics understood that stability is a gift you give first to yourself and only then indirectly to others. As this steadiness takes root, you begin to experience a different kind of strength. Not the strength of endurance, but the strength of restraint. Not the strength of sacrifice, but the strength of discernment. This strength does not announce itself. It simply holds, and in holding, you create space for thought, for growth, for silence. Space where your identity is no longer defined by rescue, but by self-mastery. Space where you can finally direct your energy toward the work that is truly yours. As this steadiness becomes familiar, a deeper challenge emerges. Without the constant demand to respond, you are left with yourself, and with that comes responsibility that cannot be redirected. There is no one else's crisis to organize your days, no borrowed urgency to justify neglecting your own work. This is where many people quietly return to old patterns, not because saving others was noble, but because governing oneself is demanding. Self-mastery is heavier than rescue. Rescue provides immediate feedback. Gratitude, dependence, even conflict, it all confirms that you are needed. Self-mastery offers no such reassurance. Progress is quiet. Discipline unfolds slowly. No one applauds your restraint. No one notices when you choose not to intervene. The reward is internal, and that requires maturity to value. You may notice resistance rising from within. A subtle restlessness, an urge to reinsert yourself where you no longer belong. This urge is not compassion. It is discomfort with stillness. When the noise fades, the mind looks for something to hold onto. The Stoics understood this impulse and warned against it. A restless mind seeks distraction. A disciplined mind tolerates silence. In this silence, you begin to see how much of your identity was shaped by reaction. You were decisive when others hesitated, calm when others panicked, reliable when others faltered. These traits are not flaws, but when they exist only in contrast to someone else's weakness, they are incomplete. True strength does not require comparison. It stands on its own. Now the work turns inward, not in a dramatic way, but in small, deliberate acts. You recommit to routines without announcing them. You restore order to your days without seeking validation. You practice restraint not because someone demands it, but because it sharpens your mind. This is where discipline stops being reactive and becomes generative. You may feel exposed here. Without the role of savior, you are simply a person responsible for their own standards. There is no one to blame when you fall short, no external chaos to excuse inconsistency. This accountability can feel severe, but it is clean. It does not erode you, it strengthens you. Pay attention to how your thoughts change. They become less tangled with explanation and more oriented toward action. You stop rehearsing conversations that will never happen. You stop preparing solutions for problems that are not yours. Mental energy returns, and with it, clarity. This clarity is not always comfortable. It reveals where you have delayed your own growth. Stoicism teaches that avoidance is a subtle enemy. You avoided your own unfinished work by tending to someone else's. Now that avoidance has nowhere to hide, this is not punishment, it is opportunity. You can finally address what you postponed, not because it was impossible, but because it was quieter than someone else's chaos. As you do this, your standards recalibrate. You become less impressed by intensity and more attentive to consistency. You value effort that is sustained over effort that is dramatic. This shift changes how you relate to people. You are no longer drawn to those who demand rescue. You are drawn to those who carry themselves. The people you should never save sense this change. Some attempt to re-establish the old dynamic, subtly testing your boundaries. They bring new crises framed as emergencies. Notice how your body responds. There may be a familiar pull, a reflex to engage. This is where discipline is tested, not by denying care, but by choosing proportion. You can listen without absorbing. You can acknowledge without intervening. You can remain present without becoming responsible. These distinctions matter. They preserve your integrity. They allow compassion to exist without self-erasure. This is a refined form of strength, and it requires practice. You may feel moments of doubt. You may wonder if you have become too rigid, too distant. Examine these thoughts carefully. Rigidity resists reflection. Distance avoids connection. What you are cultivating is neither. You are cultivating clarity. Clarity allows connection without confusion, care without control. As your life becomes more ordered, you may notice something unexpected. A quieter confidence, not assertiveness, not dominance, but a settled assurance that you are living within your limits. This confidence does not need to announce itself. It does not seek approval. It is grounded in daily alignment. With alignment comes respect from yourself first. You trust your judgments more because they are not constantly compromised. You say less, but what you say carries weight. You act less impulsively, but with greater effect. This is the compound interest of discipline. The Stoics believed that a person becomes free when they no longer need to be everything to everyone. Freedom is not the absence of obligation, but the presence of choice. You choose where to invest your energy. You choose which struggles you enter. You choose to let others face what is necessary for their growth. This does not make you indifferent, it makes you precise. Precision is kindness without illusion. It respects reality. It respects capacity. It respects limits. When you abandon the need to save, you create space for genuine contribution that does not cost you your identity. As this phase settles, you may grieve the loss of the old role. There was meaning in it, even if it was draining. Allow that grief. It does not mean you were wrong to change. It means you are human. The Stoics did not deny emotion. They governed it. You are no longer defined by who you rescue. You are defined by how you live, by the consistency of your actions, by the restraint of your responses, by the responsibility you accept, and the responsibility you decline. This is not an end. It is a stabilization, a platform from which real growth becomes possible. And it is here, in this quiet steadiness, that you begin to understand the title not as a warning about others, but as a discipline for yourself. With this stability in place, you begin to notice a change in how the world meets you. Situations that once pulled you in now pass without friction. You are not harder, you are clearer. And clarity alters everything. It changes what you notice, what you tolerate, and what you no longer feel compelled to explain. The absence of constant rescue reveals something important. Many problems resolve themselves when they are allowed to mature. Others dissolve when they are no longer fed attention. and some finally demand the effort they always required. None of this happens when you intervene too early. By stepping back, you have not created harm. You have restored proportion. This is where emotional restraint deepens, not as suppression, but as steadiness. You feel concern without urgency. You feel empathy without collapse. Your emotions no longer dictate immediate action. They inform judgment, and judgment decides pace. This separation is subtle but decisive. It is the difference between being led by feeling and being guided by reason. You may recall how often urgency once felt noble, how quickly you moved when someone was distressed, how ready you were to sacrifice your schedule, your focus, your silence. That readiness was not strength. It was habit reinforced by repetition. Now, as the habit dissolves, you experience something more durable: composure. Composure allows you to observe before responding, to ask whether intervention serves growth or merely postpones consequence. This question becomes a quiet filter through which all requests pass. You do not announce it. You do not argue it. You simply apply it. The people you should never save often struggle with this change. They may accuse you of indifference, or they may intensify their behavior, hoping to trigger the old response. This is not cruelty. It is conditioning. When a pattern stops working, it escalates before it collapses. Do not mistake escalation for evidence. It is a final test. What matters now is consistency. Not firmness for a moment, but steadiness over time. Boundaries fail not because they are unclear, but because they are inconsistently enforced. Each time you bend out of discomfort, you teach others that persistence will eventually override your judgment. Discipline requires that you tolerate temporary tension for long-term clarity. You may feel loneliness here, not because you are isolated, but because relationships based on dependency begin to thin. This loneliness is different from emptiness. It is spacious. It creates room for relationships that are reciprocal, not extractive. But this transition requires patience. Space feels unfamiliar before it feels peaceful. Notice how your sense of time changes. You are no longer rushing from one emotional demand to another. Days feel longer, not fuller longer. There is room to think, to reflect, to act deliberately. This is the tempo of a disciplined life. It does not chase, it advances. Stoicism places great emphasis on the internal fortress, the capacity to remain unshaken by external disorder. This fortress is not built by confrontation, but by refusal to internalize chaos. You cannot control who brings disorder to your door, but you can control whether you invite it inside. As you strengthen this internal boundary, your responses become simpler. You say less, you promise less, you intervene less, and yet, when you do act, your actions are more effective. They are not diluted by fatigue or resentment. They are measured and intentional. This phase often reveals how much of your previous effort was wasted, not because it was malicious, but because it was misaligned. You were pouring discipline into places that could not hold it. Now that discipline is reclaimed, it returns to you, it compounds. With compounding comes growth. Not dramatic, but steady. Your habits solidify, your attention sharpens, your tolerance for disorder, both internal and external, decreases. This is not rigidity, it is refinement. You have learned the cost of chaos, and you no longer subsidize it. You may notice that fewer people seek you out in crisis. This is not loss, it is filtration. Those who want rescue drift away. Those who want connection remain. Those who want to grow step closer. This reconfiguration is quiet but decisive. At times, you may question whether you have become less compassionate. Look at your actions, not your fears. Are you more honest, more consistent, more aligned? Compassion without clarity is indulgence. Clarity without compassion is cruelty. What you are cultivating is neither extreme. It is balance. Balance is not static. It requires adjustment. You will make mistakes. You will overcorrect at times. This is part of learning restraint. When this happens, return to principle, not guilt. Principle stabilizes. Guilt distorts. The Stoics did not aim to eliminate hardship. They aimed to respond to it with reason. You are doing the same. You are allowing hardship to teach where it belongs. You are no longer intercepting every lesson meant for someone else. As this understanding settles, a quiet confidence emerges, not because you have mastered others, but because you are mastering yourself. You trust your capacity to withstand discomfort without collapsing into action. You trust your judgment to choose restraint when intervention would be easier. This trust changes how you stand in the world. You are less available, but more present. Less reactive, but more effective. Less consumed, but more alive. And in this way, you continue to step away from destruction not by force, but by discipline. There comes a point where the change is no longer something you are actively maintaining. It becomes the way you live, not because you hardened yourself, but because you clarified yourself. The constant effort fades, replaced by a quiet order that holds without strain. This is when you realize how much energy was once spent resisting what you already knew. You no longer feel the urge to explain your boundaries. Explanation was always an attempt to manage perception. Now you accept that misunderstanding is part of choosing integrity. Some will misread your restraint as indifference. Others will interpret your silence as judgment. These interpretations are not yours to correct. They are reflections of expectations you no longer meet. With this acceptance comes relief. You stop rehearsing defenses. You stop anticipating emotional reactions. You stop carrying conversations in your head long after they end. Mental space returns fully. This space is not empty, it is ordered. It allows you to think deeply, to reflect without urgency, to choose without pressure. You begin to notice how differently you experience difficulty now. When challenges arise in your own life, you meet them directly. You do not postpone them by diverting attention outward. You do not numb yourself with someone else's chaos. You stay present. This presence strengthens your relationship with yourself. You become reliable to your own standards. Reliability to oneself is a rare form of trust. It is built slowly, through small decisions honored consistently. When you say you will rest, you rest. When you say you will work, you work. When you say you will step back, you step back. This alignment reduces inner conflict. You are no longer arguing with yourself. The people you should never save fade into the background of your life, not dramatically, not through confrontation, simply through lack of access. They find other outlets for their disorder, or they are forced to confront it. Either outcome is beyond your control, and that acceptance feels natural now, not forced. What remains are relationships that do not require rescue to function, conversations that are not centered on crisis, silence that does not need to be filled. These connections may be fewer, but they are steadier. They do not drain, they support mutual growth. You also notice a shift in how you listen. You are attentive without being absorbent. You hear distress without rushing to fix it. You allow others to sit with their discomfort. This is a quiet form of respect. It communicates belief in their capacity rather than doubt. At times, you may feel the old impulse return, usually when someone mirrors a version of yourself you once were. Someone struggling, scattered, avoidant. Compassion arises naturally. The difference now is discernment. You do not confuse recognition with obligation. You can care without crossing into rescue. This discernment sharpens your sense of identity. You know where you end and others begin. This boundary is not rigid. It is clear. It allows closeness without collapse. It allows distance without guilt. This clarity is one of the most valuable outcomes of discipline. Stoicism often speaks of freedom, but not in the modern sense. Not freedom as indulgence, but freedom as independence from inner compulsion. You are experiencing this now. You no longer feel compelled to intervene, to justify, to absorb. You choose your actions deliberately. This choice is the foundation of freedom. As your life becomes less reactive, your growth accelerates quietly. You read with more focus. You reflect with more honesty. You act with more intention. None of this is dramatic. It is cumulative. The compound effect of disciplined restraint begins to show not outwardly at first, but internally. You are less fragmented. less divided between who you are and who you perform. This integration brings a calm confidence that does not seek expression. It simply is. Others may sense it, but you do not rely on that recognition. Your standards are internal now. You also become more selective with your energy, not protective, but respectful. Energy is finite. Attention is finite. The Stoics understood that where you place them determines the quality of your life. You are no longer scattering them in response to noise. This selectivity creates a deeper form of generosity. When you give fully. When you engage, you are present. When you support, it is sustainable. You are no longer leaking effort through constant overextension. There is a quiet dignity in this way of living. It does not announce itself. It does not seek approval. It does not rush. It moves steadily, guided by principle. This dignity is felt most clearly in moments of restraint, when you choose not to act, not to speak, not to say. You may realize that the destruction you feared was never external. It was internal erosion, loss of clarity, loss of self-trust, loss of direction. By stepping away from those you should never save, you did not become smaller. You became intact. Intactness changes how you face the future. You are not bracing. You are prepared. You know that challenges will come, but you trust your ability to meet them without losing yourself. This trust is earned, not assumed. As this understanding settles, the title reveals its deeper meaning. It is not a warning fueled by bitterness. It is a discipline shaped by experience. A reminder that strength without restraint becomes self-destruction, and compassion without clarity becomes self-betrayal. You are no longer learning this lesson intellectually. You are living it, quietly, consistently. And that is why it holds by the time you reach this point. The lesson no longer feels sharp. It feels settled, not because it lost its weight, but because you absorbed it fully. What once felt like a warning now feels like orientation, a way of moving through life that no longer requires constant correction. You understand now that saving the wrong people was never about them alone. It was about how you related to discomfort, responsibility, and your own limits. It was about where you placed your discipline. You once believed discipline meant endurance at all costs. Now you see it means endurance in the right direction. There is a quiet humility in this realization. You recognize how easy it is to mistake self-sacrifice for virtue, how tempting it is to confuse exhaustion with strength. You no longer admire suffering for its own sake. You admire clarity. You admire steadiness. You admire the kind of self-control that knows when to act and when to stand still. Your inner silence has returned not as emptiness, but as depth. Thoughts arise without urgency. Decisions form without pressure. You are not constantly pulled outward. This silence is not withdrawal from life. It is presence without noise. From here, action is cleaner, more deliberate. You also accept something difficult and liberating. You cannot live someone else's life for them. No amount of effort, patience, or understanding can replace another person's will. Accepting this does not make you colder. It makes you honest. And honesty is the foundation of respect both for others and for yourself. You no longer fear being misunderstood as much as you once did. You have seen the cost of constant explanation. You know now that clarity lived consistently speaks louder than words repeated endlessly. Those who are capable of meeting you at this level will recognize it. Those who are not were never meant to stay. Your discipline feels different now. It is quieter, less rigid, more integrated. You do not force yourself forward. You guide yourself. When temptation arises to intervene, to fix, to absorb, you notice it without obeying it. This pause is power. It gives you choice. Choice is the true measure of self-mastery. Not control over others, but freedom from inner compulsion. You act because you decide, not because you are pulled. You give because you choose, not because you feel guilty. You step back because you understand proportion, not because you are afraid. This understanding reshapes how you view compassion. Compassion no longer means removing struggle. It means respecting the process of growth. even when it is uncomfortable to witness. It means allowing people to encounter themselves fully. This is not detachment, it is trust in reality, in consequence, in capacity. You also trust yourself more. You trust that you can withstand discomfort without dissolving into action. You trust that you can care without consuming yourself. You trust that your worth is not measured by how much you endure for others, but by how well you live in alignment with your principles. There is a calm confidence in this trust. It does not announce itself. It does not seek validation. It simply holds. In moments where you once felt compelled to intervene, you now feel grounded. In moments where you once felt torn, you now feel clear. You see now why the people you should never save would have destroyed you, not through cruelty, but through gradual erosion, through the quiet loss of discipline, the steady draining of attention, the slow blurring of identity. You stepped away not in anger, but in understanding. That is why the lesson endures. This is the posture you carry forward, not defensive, not closed, but firm, deliberate, and internally governed. You move through life with fewer entanglements and deeper commitments, fewer reactions and more choices. Nothing about this requires constant affirmation. It reveals itself in the quality of your days, in the steadiness of your routines, in the silence of your mind, in the way you respond when pressure appears, and when you reflect, as the Stoics did, you recognize that this work is never finished. Discipline is not a destination. It is a practice renewed daily. The moment you stop paying attention, old patterns wait patiently, but now you know how to see them. So you continue, quietly, intentionally. You return to your principles when the world grows loud. You return to restraint when urgency tempts you. You return to yourself when distraction pulls. And if this way of living resonates, if it sharpens something in you, steadies something in you, carry it forward. Reflect on it. Test it in silence. Let it shape your actions over time. That is the work. And that is what is being built, day by day, by those who choose discipline over rescue, clarity over chaos, and self-mastery over slow destruction, built by Stoicism.